Hi everyone, Simon here. Hope you're keeping fit and well. In this video, I'm going to talk to you about the most important aspect of everything I've talked about so far, and this is really the culmination of all the other videos put together. Now, there's a really wildly popular video called The Mathematics of Weight Loss, and I think it's a little bit of a misnomer. It should really be called The Biochemistry of Weight Loss. This video is the real maths of weight loss, so just follow along for the ride and everything will be explained. By way of overview, I'm going to be talking about the daily requirements of caloric intake, the effects of exercise, the effects of food, and how this all integrates with dieting. Let's talk about our daily requirements. Of course, we have our resting metabolic rate. This is about 70% or so of our total caloric requirements, and this is reflective of what our brain's requirement to suck in energy, our other organs, for example, our liver, our muscles, and so on. We also have the thermic effects of physical activity. So that's the energy required to do our physical activity, but also the energy required to take us back down and reset ourselves to our basal metabolic rate. The third aspect of our daily requirements is what's called the thermic effect of food, and I'm going to talk about all of these in just a moment. First of all, we have our resting metabolic rate. Now, this will depend on our gender, our height, weight, and age. Now, there are different calculators for doing this. I'm going to show you one called the Mifflin-St. Jean calculator, which is recommended by the American Dietary Association. The first thing you'll see in the formulas over here is that they are different for men and for women, and basically men have a higher caloric requirement than women do. If we have a look at the formula, and remembering that the human body is made of active tissues, so they all need to be fed, they all need to be kept alive. So the more of us there is, the more caloric requirement there is too. So depending on our weight, we need to have more calories. So 10 times the weight plus 6.25 times the height minus 5 times the age plus a corrective factor of 5 for men or minus 161 for the ladies. So the bigger we are in terms of our height and our weight, the more of us there is, the more calories that we need. However, if we are older, we need to have fewer calories. There's an inverse relationship there. We also have to adjust for the levels of activity. So that's just the resting metabolic rate, but we then have to try and determine, depending on the amount of activity that we do, how much extra we need to take that into account. Now, although I've just said that women need to have fewer calories than men, they actually have a higher requirement in terms of vitamins and minerals. Let me just explain briefly. Women are at higher risk of osteoporosis, so calcium is very important. They are more at risk of having iron deficiency anemia through menstruation, so iron stores are important too. Folic acid, particularly for women of childbearing age. So although the caloric requirements are less, the mineral requirements are larger. Having said all of this, there's about a 10% inaccuracy which the authors do acknowledge. You can go online and there are a variety of websites which will give you a calculator for this. This one's acaloriecounter.com, and you can put in your details over here and work out your caloric maintenance level, as it were. Now, I've done this for you, and I've done this by decade, and I've worked out for someone who's 5'10", which is the average height in the UK, and I've put them at a chubby 200 pounds, that these are the data which will be produced. Now, that's a lot of numbers. Let's have a look at pictures instead. Along the horizontal axis, you can see the age by decade, so 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, and 80. And for each one of these, I've got bars for the caloric requirements for someone who's sedentary, lightly active, moderately active, very active, extremely active. And you can see very clearly that for any of these ages, there is a relationship between the amount of activity performed and the caloric requirements for each of these. Right, let me show you over here. For someone who is 40 and they are lightly active, well, the caloric requirement will be 2,500 calories per day. Now, if they increase this to being moderately active, actually this increases up to about 2,800 calories or 3,200 calories or so if they are very active. increasing up to about 3,700 if they are extremely active. So you can see clearly there's a relationship between the amount of calories required and the amount of activity. Also, you can see a downward trend by age. So for any age and for any amount of activity, there's an approximately 3% drop in caloric requirements. And what this means very simply is twofold for an older person. Firstly, if you have the same meals day in, day out between the age of 20 and the age of 80, you will wind up putting on weight. Why? Because the requirements decrease with age, and so if you keep the amount the same and your requirements keep going down, there will become a point where you will go into increasing excess. That's the first point. The second point, of course, is that an older person will find it harder to cut back on the calories in terms of dieting. So it's actually harder to diet as an older person than as a younger person. But you can also think as well that if you add in exercise into the mix, then you can actually help to ameliorate some of that. So for an older person, diet is of course very important. It's harder in of itself. Exercise might be necessary or increasingly necessary to help ameliorate some of those effects. So these are the definitions, what sedentary, lightly active, moderately active are, etc. You can have a look at those in case you're wondering. In terms of the impact of increasing activity on the basic metabolic requirements, even being sedentary has an impact too on the resting metabolic rate, because no one actually sort of sat there like that all day long. Everyone's got some degree of activity, but all of these are going to be relative to the sedentary one. So if you are lightly active, you will increase the caloric requirements by 15%. If you're moderately active, then the next jump is only 13% and followed by 10% for being very active. So there's a diminishing return until you get to being extremely active, where you get a massive bump up in your energy requirements. In terms of what that actually means is that there are basically diminishing returns on the whole for people as they wish to do more exercise in terms of losing weight. So if you're purely into doing exercise for losing weight, you're actually better off doing light to moderate activity than starting to get either very active or extremely active and then starting to pick up various sprains and injuries resulting from all that increased activity. In terms of diet versus exercise, and this is where I think really that video and that TED Talk went really wrong. We do not need to think about breaking down fat in terms of dietary plans. The main component and the single biggest take-home message I can tell you is that the main component to weight loss is actually diet. It's extremely difficult to break down fat. Okay, if you have a look at me at the end of an hour's exercise on the elliptical, I literally look as if I've had a heart attack. I'm pale, I'm sweaty, I'm sweating, feeling great, but you know, it's not a great look. It's really hard effort to break down fat into its constituents. Prevention is always better than the cure. It was always going to be a balance of both. You've got to work out, you know, what's important. My own personal example, and I've been working very hard here, is I've lost, in terms of my caloric expenditure, only 30% is done via hard exercise. 70% is via dietary control. So diet beats exercise, hands down. All the time. I'm not saying it's not important. Exercise is important too. Depends also on what you're trying to gain from all of it. I'll talk about that in a moment. Here is another important point, and I've addressed that in another video, which is that the duration is absolutely key. You need to be exercising for a long duration to really start getting into the calorie burn zone. Here is me on the elliptical. I'm doing exactly the same exercise. I don't change the rate. What I do the exercise, just the force. It's done in a cyclical manner here, and you can see very clearly there's the upwards trend. Every single time in the elliptical, it's exactly the same. If you divide this hour into two halves, the latter half an hour is more valuable in terms of caloric burn than the first half an hour is. The next thing is, well, how to exercise? Do you go for intensity or do you go for duration? Duration is absolutely the key to calorie burn. Okay, it is better to do lighter exercise for a longer duration than intense exercise for a short duration. Okay, if you're interested in building strength, well, that's fine, but strength training has to focus on intensity rather than on duration. Some people are out to become slim, that's all I wanted to do, so I was going for the cardio. Some people are out to become really buff, so they need to do strength training. Some people want to have some kind of a mixture of the two. That's where you really need to have personal trainer, okay? Similarly with the strength training as well, because you've got to get the balance right, and it's actually quite complicated. In terms of diet though, in terms of losing weight, cardio is the way forward. I just wanted to show you, I've shown this on another video, this is me having gone for a walk for just over an hour, and I have lost 554 calories from that, okay? Now that did not take intense exercise, that did not take investment in an elliptical, did not take investment in a fancy pair of trainers, okay? It's very simple. Light to moderate exercise for a decent duration is what's going to burn you your calories. Let me show you another example of having walked for here for an hour and 3/4. Here I've lost 848 calories. This is not rocket science, okay? This is simple. Let's now talk about the effect of activity. So you've got the exercise itself and the post-exercise oxygen consumption as you reset back to normal. So here's me from the other evening. Now I didn't have the watch on the first part of the day and only put it on in the evening, and so this part here you can see is my resting metabolic rate really, and here is when I'm doing my physical activity here on the elliptical, and then over here I'm now going to the rest and recuperation phase, and then following midnight I basically went to bed. Let's look at this in a bit more detail now. So each of these bars is the number of calories that my Fitbit has told me that I've been expending, like so. And so in the time before I did the exercise, it was about 25 calories each 15 minutes. Now over here I did the exercise for an hour, and here's me now in a rest and recuperation phase. Now you can see visually over here, roughly speaking, it's taken about 2¼ hours to get to the next phase, which is back to basal metabolic rate over here. So the average of all of this is about 40 calories per 15 minutes before it sort of hits back down to the 24-25 calories per 15 minutes beforehand. When I go to sleep, it's 18 calories per 15 minutes. Important take-homes from this is the first half an hour here is really the most metabolically active, and that really doesn't make much of a difference any time of day that you do this. In terms of the recuperation phase, we're talking about basically another hour and 3/4, so the whole thing about 2¼ hours where you are more metabolically active. And so this helps to actually answer a very important question, which is when should you exercise? If you go online, you will see that some people will say, oh, you should exercise in the morning first thing because that way it bumps up your metabolic rate for the rest of the day to a higher level. Okay, what I've shown you over here is actually no, that's for 2¼ hours in total, so it does not extend for very long, and the bulk of it is actually the first half an hour. Some people will say do it in the evenings because when you go to sleep your metabolic rate goes down, and therefore if you've pumped yourself up by doing all of this exercise, then you'll be burning more energy through the evening and through the night. Again, this has a limited time effect. Okay, so in terms of sort of maxing out the number of calories that you are going to be burning with this, you're only really adding an extra 60 calories per hour extra on top. So if you are doing this in the evening, you are going to bed, well actually you're not losing that much. So the question is, when's the best time to do exercise? The answer is whenever it suits you, whenever it's sustainable for you. That is the single best time to do it. Let's now talk about the effect of food. Now, if you're going to eat any food, it actually requires energy to digest it and to store it. And you can actually measure the effect of that in things called respiration chambers, which means it's all pretty complex. The short of it is it varies by the foodstuff. So carbohydrates and fat are pretty easy for the body to digest and to store and metabolize. Only 10% of the food ingested, or rather only 10% of the calories ingested from that food goes towards processing it. Okay, so if you were to have 1,000 calories of carbs or 1,000 calories of fat, only 900 would go through to potential storage and utility. 100 calories would be expended on processing. Protein's a different story. So about a third of a protein heavy diet or a protein heavy meal would actually be required to actually process that into usable parts, as it were, for the body. So if you were to have 1,000 calories of protein, 700 would be available for energy, metabolism, storage, etc. So if you were to compare a high protein diet with a high fat diet, okay, you will actually end up taking in fewer calories from a high protein diet than from a high fat diet, because actually you've actually had to burn more of that protein off to allow it to enter the potential storage and use pool. Let's talk about the next steps, because we've talked about calculating our basal metabolic rate. Let's talk about keeping a food diary. A food diary is absolutely critical to a diet, because you've got to understand how much you're taking in, when you're taking it in, what you're taking in. Yeah, it's just critical to the whole thing. Personally, it wasn't something I understood, wanted to understand, had the time to learn, just wasn't happening. And that for me, I think, was probably the key failure over the last few years. Game changer is actually go and get the Fitbit app. You can get it for free, and it actually gives you the ability to very simply log what foods that you're having. You won't have necessarily every single food that you're eating there, but you'll have an approximation quite simply, and I would say that that is the way forward. In terms of joining the Fitbit universe, if you wanted to get more into it, then the next thing I would recommend is actually getting the scales, because there's no cheating with that. It's done all via the Wi-Fi, and you take your weight, it puts it on the app, stores it. There's no messing about. And sort of last and least is actually getting a hold of a Fitbit watch, and that will help you determine your energy expenditure. But in terms of the utility of the Fitbit stuff, the app first and foremost, the watch last and least. Having done all of that, so you've worked out how much you're going to be taking in, you've kept a food diary so you can plan and adjust accordingly. What should you expect? The most important things to say is that weight loss is not linear. There is a common misconception that calories in minus the calories out is what your net effect is going to be, and it's a simple equation. It isn't. The human body is constantly seeking to conserve energy for the winter that will hopefully never happen. Now, in an environment where calories are abundant, the excess will start to be stored, and during periods of caloric restriction, energy stores will begin to be expended. However, the caveat is that the body will adjust as much as possible to prevent those storage areas from being lost, and what it might do is to reduce the resting metabolic rate. And what this effectively means is that the first 2 weeks of a diet are really the hardest, because the body is going to be throwing whatever it can possibly do to prevent itself from losing weight, which is why you stand on the scales after the first week and you think, oh, well, that blood, sweat and tears of trying to lose weight, and I haven't lost weight, or you might have even gained weight. Yeah, it can be very discouraging. And then people soldier on into the second week and think, oh, and then they go on, and again, they're just not seeing much of a benefit for all the effort that they've put in, and it can be soul destroying. And that's why I say to people, do not look at the scales for the first 2 weeks, or if you are looking at them, just ignore it, okay? Because it's really from the third week that you'll really start to see the benefit. Here's my own weight loss journey, and you can see here the first couple of weeks was just hell. I have to tell you, it didn't really lose very much weight. It was just a little bit. Suddenly, after about the third week, it started to go down into a linear phase of about 1.3 kilos a week. And then around about this point over here, between weeks 11 and 13, I hit a plateau. I'll talk about that in a bit more detail soon, before going back down again into a more rapid and more fulfilling decline in my weight. Now, let's just briefly focus in on this plateau period over here. You can see between these couple of weeks, 81.8, 81, 80.7. Wasn't great. Really, really difficult, throwing everything at it as much as possible. Now, if you have a look on Google and you have a look at how many calories it makes up a kilogram, you'll see the number here of about 7,700 calories. Now, that was based on a sample of people, presumably in a more linear phase. For myself, having worked this out through the Fitbit, it's about 9,500 per kilo. Okay, and during that plateau phase, you can see that actually it has increased tremendously, up to 45,000 calories per kilo. Okay, which is why I wasn't losing anything. Now, how do you deal with plateau, and what does it all mean? So the first thing is, you've got to be really honest with yourself. Are you sticking to your goals? Are you sticking to your diet? Are you snacking on the carbs? Okay, is anything going wrong? That's the first thing you've got to do. Now, it might be that you might need to do a little tweak here and there, whether it might be reducing your caloric intake, it might be increasing your expenditure somehow, or how you're expending it as well. It might need zigzagging, so instead of eating to a certain level, shifting up and down, and I've talked about that in another video. It might even be that you might need to see a doctor if something might not be working right anymore, for example, the thyroid gland. But assuming all of that is all okay, what I say to you is keep calm and carry on. This is me, okay, during that phase, and you can see here that I was zigzagging, and you can see here that I carried on being in negative balance. And I said to myself, I said, look, at the end of the day, even if my body is doing its absolute best, bending over backwards to stop me from losing weight, because that's what the body does, I'm just going to carry on. Keep calm, carry on, because eventually the body will decompensate and start to lose calories again. And that's exactly what happened. So let's just sort of sum up very briefly a lot of the key points from all of this. First of all, you need to know roughly how much you need per day. That's just basic. Next, you need to understand your intake. Okay, the way to do that is, personally, just get the Fitbit app, because it's just brilliant at doing that. And then you've got to make a plan. You've got to work out, how am I going to go from breakfast and eat breakfast and go forward through to lunch, okay, and from lunch to supper without snacking, being suitably distracted, and without having too many calories in any of those. For me personally, I was on about a 1,500 calorie per day plan, and that worked for me. Okay, you've got to work out what's safe and sustainable for you. Next thing, you've got to keep it sustainable. Now, I haven't talked much about this, but it does need mentioning, and I'll just mention it now. We all know that people who lose weight often can regain weight, and that happens pretty quickly if they're not careful. The reason for this is very simple. When we're putting on weight, the first thing that happens is the fat cells, the lipocytes, the adipocytes, whatever you want to call them, take on more fat. They then start to increase in number, and then those increased number of nascent fat cells take on more fat. Okay, so there's a sort of stepwise progression upwards. On the way down, you still have the same number of adipocytes. You still have the same number of fat cells. It's just that they've lost fat within them. They haven't died, they haven't gone away, they haven't disappeared. So the potential is still there. Hence, if you go back to your bad habits, then they'll just start to put on those lipid storage once again and swell up and hypertrophy. So whatever you do, you've got to make sure that what you're doing is sustainable. Next, keep it safe. Keep a safe number of calories. You don't do yourself or your body any harm. If you're taking exercise, remember, light to moderate exercise is actually far more beneficial than moderate and severe extremes of exercise. Finally, just to sum this all up, the most important aspect to remember is that your weight control is one of the few things that you have control of in your life. There are very few things that you have control, but the amount of food that goes in is a behavioural issue, and you've got to take control. Live smart. Thank you very much everyone for watching. I hope you found it useful and beneficial. If you have, please do support the channel, like, share and subscribe. And this will really be the end of these weight loss videos now. This was really just to help encourage everyone over the first couple of weeks of January. Hope it's encouraged and enthused you. I know it certainly has helped a couple of people to get on the journey. Now is a critical time for just carrying on 2 weeks or so in. And just if you've had difficulties the first couple of weeks with the weight loss, it will hopefully all start to really go forward and smoothly from now on. There will be some plateaus to deal with, but don't worry, you'll overcome it. And just stay well and healthy. All the very best.